Will not be thirsty or have to come here to draw water. And Jesus said to her, Go call your husband and come here. The woman answered him, I have no husband. Jesus said to her, You are right in saying, I have no husband. For you have had 5 husbands, and the one you now have is not your husband. What you have said is true. The woman said to him, Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship. And Jesus said to her, Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem you will worship the Father. Will you worship the Father? You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know. For salvation is from the Jews, but the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. The woman said to him, I know that Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things. Jesus said to her, I who speak to you am he. And that had to be a eye-opening statement. You would think it would be an eye-opening statement for her when he makes that, I who speak to you am he. It's a pretty straightforward answer, probably the most straightforward answer that he gives anyone about who he is that we find in the Bible. I didn't research that in depth, but when you just think about the interactions that he has with people, that's probably as straightforward as he is with anyone about who he was. So let's go back to our questions, and we'll kind of walk through and use those as a guide. Question 1, why do you think that Jesus left Galilee to go to Judea? So if you go back to the beginning of chapter 4, it says that he leaves Galilee, leaves Judea. Let me get that right. Departed again for Galilee. Yeah, he left Judea and was headed to Galilee. Why do you think he left? I actually wrote that question wrong, didn't I?
That's why I was fixing to ask you.
I did. I knew I had it messed up. I got to reverse those.
Well, he was there to begin with.
So don't look at what I wrote. Look at what I thought.
That's what I was thinking. At least we don't have to think about what Bill's thinking. That could be really bad.
Wow. So anyway, why did he leave point A to go to point B? The locations are not necessarily what is important in this, other than where they are. One's south, one's north. And there's an area of land in between. And we know that to be Samaria. Sorry?
He had a mission on the way.
He had a mission on the way, yep. There's probably a lot of factors as to why he left. One is that there's this appointed time that he was going to meet the Samaritan woman. Why else would he possibly have left? What indication does John give about what was going on there in...
Baptizing of the disciples?
Okay, there was a lot of baptizing going on, and who had caught notice of that? So why did that even come into play? And I think it did, okay, but we obviously know God has a timetable here, right? He knew the Samaritan woman was going to be there. It's time for Jesus to go. But God doesn't just on a whim make decisions. Like there's things that play into those deals. And so you have these Pharisees that are there. What had they caught notice of?
They were baptizing a lot of people.
Yeah, baptizing more than John now. Why was that a concern that Jesus would want to move away from that?
We know they opposed him in a lot of ways.
Okay, they opposed him in a lot of ways. A lot of it was they didn't understand.
Right.
Well, all of it was they didn't understand, but they did oppose him in a lot of ways.
Very too legalistic to
Yeah.
get what he was doing.
Yeah. I want to go back to chapter 2. And if you look at chapter 2, verse 4, which is where his mom approaches him and says, we're out of wine, do something about this. And you remember what his answer was? My hour's not yet come. What happens if he stays and this large group of people now, and the Pharisees begin asking all these questions, and the crowd just continues to grow there in Judea?
So he might have enough people for him that it would be harder for them to crucify him?
Could have been that they wanted to crucify him earlier.
Or, yeah. They could go either
So
way.
it wasn't time for the confrontation to begin yet. Now, playing into that again, because God is not just like, we get very narrow-minded sometimes, and we have one thing on our mind. It's kind of like a guy walking into Walmart. We're walking in because we need something. We need the one item that we're walking in to get, unless we get a list sent with us. And we go in and we get it, and we go out. And nothing tends to distract us for the most part, unless we go into Lowe's or Home Depot, and then we're really distracted.
Say, you're not my dog.
But
You can't do one.
But if we have to go in a grocery store, it's typically because we need one item or we've been told to go get something. God doesn't work that way. Like, God is, everything in the world is working together. All things work together for good to them that love the Lord, who are called according to his purpose. So all things are working. So you got to take into account the Samaritan woman is going to happen. You also have this situation with the Pharisees that's going on. So God says, all right, time to move. We got this stuff that's fixing to happen anyway, and we need to deal with that. And so we find that he leaves, and he leaves with a purpose, but he also leaves because of a purpose. Does that make sense? So he leaves with a purpose to talk to the Samaritan woman. He leaves also because if he stayed, it would have been ushered in probably what happened before it was time for it to happen. So we see God's providence in many ways in this. Now, if you look at question 2, then John records in verse 4 that Jesus had to pass through Samaria, and actually uses that language, especially in the ESV. It says, verse 4, and he had to pass through Samaria. King James says that a little bit different, but it's almost even more emphatic that he had to go through Samaria. Brother Joe, what does verse 4 say?
He must needs go through Samaria.
Yeah, he must needs go through Samaria. So it was, John's writing this saying he had to go through Samaria. Now, was this the only way to Galilee from Judea? I actually got it right in the second question. Was this the only way from Judea to Galilee? No, it was a way, but would the Jews typically go that way? They would avoid it, and it goes back to this whole unclean thing, right? They considered the Samaritans a mixed race. They considered them to be unclean, and they considered themselves, if they interacted with them, to be unclean. So they would avoid it. Now, to avoid it, it was about 3 days additional journey. That's a ballpark, depending on how quickly you went, but just a ballpark of 3 days additional journey to get from Judea to Galilee, or vice versa, if you went around Samaria. So it was much easier to go through Samaria as far as time-wise and the physical traveling. Why did he have to go through Samaria? Because both our versions seem to imply he had to go through Samaria. John seems to be writing that way.
He had an encounter with the woman.
Yeah.
Destined.
Was it just for the woman, though?
Well, for the whole, because she went on and converted a lot, so it was for all the Samaritans, I would assume.
Mm-hmm. So it would have been.
It was for her, but also the witness that she was, and all the people that heard because of her experience with Christ.
Yeah, she was faithful to do what she was supposed to do, and because of that, the Sychar, there, the village or community, actually heard about Christ because she went and done what she was supposed to do. Now, so we can say it was definitely for the woman. It was also for the village that was there. But when you think about just in Christ's big overall ministry, if you remember, I think it was during sermon, we talked about the difference between chapter 3 and chapter 4. And who did Christ interact with in chapter 3? And specifically, the guy that came to him was, remember his name? Nicodemus. Specifically Nicodemus. So this was a well-respected man in the Jewish community. So he was interacting with the Jews, but he was interacting not with just the common person Jew. He was interacting with someone that was well-respected, highly regarded, held a position in the Jewish community. And now, because he must go through Samaria, he interacts with this Samaritan woman. Now, was she of a high position in Samaria?
No, quite the opposite.
Yeah, extremely opposite, right? So we find him go from the most, I'm not going to say Nicodemus was the most important, but he was pretty important. So he goes from there to a lady that, and again, John's recording and we're reading here, but was there anybody else there?
No,
Why was there no one else there drawing water?
because she didn't want to be there with anybody else, because they all looked down on her, so she went after the rest of them did, so that she wouldn't have to interact or listen to their gossip.
She was, or them talk about her,
Right.
because she was not looked on very favorably by the community.
Do you think, though, that he knew when he went to Samaria that this was going to happen?
Absolutely. I think that's why he let the disciples go on, so that he could have the interaction with her and they could walk back and see that he had already talked with her or was talking with her.
He was there as the gospel be spread to the poor, the lost, and the Gentile.
Yeah. And not just, and it's absolutely right, but not just the Gentiles as abroad, but even the lowest of what we might term the Gentiles. So the most disregarded, the person that was completely out of place in society, the one that probably had to come to the well by herself because she would have been such an outcast if she would have come when the rest of the women would have come to gather water. If you'll notice, John actually notes the time of day. It's interesting when you think about, and I know I've mentioned this, but John is writing in retrospect. So he's not just writing down what he thinks is important in that moment in time as the events are happening, like journaling, kind of thing. Like some of you take notes on a sermon and you're writing down what's happening as that goes on. Some, I think, have mentioned to me, I think Tina's done it sometimes, that you go back and you listen to the sermon and you come back and fill in. And maybe sometimes when you come back and fill in, you write things that you didn't catch the first time it goes through. John has had several years now, and he's inspired by God. I'm not taking that away in any way. But John is also looking back and he's saying, here is something that's important that happened. I didn't necessarily catch it then, but because I'm now able to write about it in retrospect, it was important. Notice that he identifies what time of day it was. And what time of day would that have been?
I think it was about noon, wasn't it?
Yeah, around noon. Extremely out of place for women to go gather water at noon. They would gather it in the morning when it was cool. They would gather it in the evening after it had cooled off. But to come in the middle of the day, when it was the hottest, and if you remember, she says, the well is deep. You don't get water from a deep well without doing some labor. And so this would have been a physically strenuous time. And she's doing it in a hot part of the day. Again, she's coming when no one else is there because she doesn't want to deal with probably what they're going to be saying about her. And so Jesus, I think, absolutely knows. And I think he had to go through Samaria because, again, everything we've said is right. To witness to her, for the rest of that community to know it, but to also show us, as we're sitting here today, that the most important person in Pocahontas needs to hear the gospel of Jesus Christ. But also the lowest person that may be living in a tent under the bridge needs to hear the gospel of Jesus Christ. And we can't distinguish anywhere in between those two spectrums because every person needs to hear it. And sometimes, and I don't know that we do this intentionally, because I think all of us in this room would say everyone needs to hear the gospel of Jesus Christ. I think we would all say that. I think that we get caught up, though, in our worldly mindset sometimes, and we're more comfortable witnessing to those that are more like us than those who are not. And we have to remember that Christ broke every cultural barrier in this situation, and he spoke to someone that he should not have been speaking to as a Jewish man, speaking to a Samaritan woman. We didn't even talk about that. You know, men and women, if it was not your spouse, didn't interact in that culture in that way. And yet he does that. And with who it is, would even cause more shame on him from a worldly perspective. But he does it. And so I think it's so important for us to realize that he did talk to this highly established Jewish leader, but he also went to this place where he knew he was going to interact with this woman that was of the lowest standard, especially to a Jew. And he interacted with both, and both of them needed to hear the gospel. So I think he absolutely had to go through because God wanted us to see that the gospel goes to all people.
But then also, you know, he talks about the ones who are forgiven the most are the ones that are most appreciative.
Absolutely. They acknowledge theirs.
With the disciples got fussed at him for sitting down at the table with sinners. Well, I mean, that was about the same thing as what he was doing there. You know, he said it's the sick that needs a physician.
That's right. That's an interesting thought too, because as guys, sometimes we don't like going to the doctor, and so we put off saying that we're sick, right? Because we don't want to go to the physician. So we ignore the fact that we really are sick. But we still need the physician, don't we? And Christ makes that statement because he says, those that realize that they need the physician realize that they are sick, and then they have to go to the right physician for that. And because we don't go to a chiropractor if we've got a sinus infection kind of thing, right? We go to the right physician for the right thing. Individuals that realize the sinfulness of their sinfulness, which is, again, all of us are just as guilty as anyone. But those who realize it are the most grateful. Donna brought that up. Young man that come forward Sunday morning, if you were here Sunday night, you saw a much different guy Sunday night than you saw Sunday morning before church. And he was out here in the foyer talking to everybody Sunday night. Sunday morning, he walks in and he sits down. I wish you could have been at the altar with him. I haven't heard someone pour their heart out like that in ages. And when he got up, there was a puddle of water. And he didn't spill a drink. He realized where he was, and he realized what he needed. And it would do well if we would realize that. And sometimes, and I'm guilty of this, growing up in church, I don't realize the sinfulness of where I was, whatever you want to call that. And he did, he does. And that's why I said Sunday night, he was a different guy. And by different, I don't mean that everything in his life was perfect. What I mean was he had a joy in his life that he did not have when he walked in Sunday morning. That's what was different. It wasn't that he was perfect and he wasn't going to do any kind of sinful things when he walked out these doors. It wasn't that everything in his life was completely different as far as actions and that kind of thing. But the joy in his life, when he gets up, he said, it was the greatest statement. And he says, I asked him the question, have you been saved before? And he said, I thought I was, but I know I am now. There's probably a lot of people walking around thinking that they are, and they've never really found the joy of Christ. And sometimes they get it much better than what we do. All right, question 3. What is unique about what John records in verse 6? So verse 6 says, Jacob's well was there, so Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey, was sitting beside the well. It was about the 6th hour. So what's unique about verse 6 that John records for us?
Christ was physically tired.
Yeah. You think John noted that for a reason? Now again, John's writing in retrospect, right? If John would have wrote this at the time that it was happening, John would have probably may not have even included it because he was tired too. He may have been just a little bit hungrier than Christ, and that's why he went to get food. I don't really know, but at the same time, John was probably tired as well. But he notes here that he's wearied. Why would John note that? Why is that important for us to know?
Well, Christ he doesn't face physical obstacles like we do, then everything else is void. He's 100% man.
Yeah, isn't it important in order for us to realize that Christ suffered in all ways that we do, in order for us to realize that he was the perfect sacrifice for us, he experienced everything we do, he was tempted in all ways that we were, weariness. You ever use the excuse of not witnessing to someone because you're just too tired? Or you didn't get up and go to church because you were too tired? What if Christ would have said, this woman right here really needs to hear about me, but man, I'm just too tired. And so John notes that he was wearied. And so what does he do? He asks her, he interacts with her, he asks her for a drink of water. He finds a way to have a conversation with her. Now, does it help him physically? Yes, maybe. We actually don't even know if he ever gets the water. But think about John noting this. I mean, there's a reason that he wrote in there that Christ was wearied from his journey. Part of it is so that we can kind of say, I really don't have an excuse for just being tired. Part of it is so that we can note that Christ was actually human just like us, and he suffered in the same ways that we do. Question 4 then, what was unique about this woman drawing water at the 6th hour? We've already talked about that. 6th hour was around noon. Was this a normal time for people to draw water? We've really kind of touched on all of that. It's not the normal time for women of that culture to draw water. It would have been early in the morning, late in the evening. Also something that's biblical scholars / archaeologists that study Bible times, they've identified that there were 2 wells that were closer to Sychar than what this one was, which means that she traveled a greater distance probably to get away from the people that knew her in order to not maybe be criticized like she would have been if she was around the group, which then makes this interaction that Christ has with her even more unique because she's went somewhere that she could have went somewhere shorter. And you've experienced this, like in your mind you thought, man, I could have went somewhere else, and then you go to where you end up going and something happens. You have a conversation that you wouldn't have had if you would have went to the place that would have been quicker or whatever, and you realize that God was working in some way. Same thing is going on here. We just see it in the Bible in this way. Question 5, verse 8 tells us that Jesus' disciples had gone to buy food. How does John know this story if all the disciples had went away? So I kind of mentioned this a minute ago, like who else was there? What indication do we have of the number of people that was here? We know Jesus was there, right? And we know the woman was there.
I think that John was still there.
It says the disciples went away, and John doesn't make the note that, but I was still there. We don't technically know. What we would think, based upon how he has written this, is that either the woman told the story or Christ did. He was inspired. We know that was true. But we got to believe that, because if you read on down, you get to the end, if you remember, the woman goes and tells those people from the village then come to him. The disciples are probably asking, Like John's probably not only John, but the other disciples as well are asking, like, how did this all happen? We were just gone for a minute, and you've got this whole crowd here from a village that's a good distance away. Like, how did this occur? You got to imagine that their interest was piqued on this, right? But doesn't appear that John was there. So someone had to tell. Now, why is that important? Or is it important?
So was John in the town with the disciples
Probably.
getting food?
Probably.
So is this the same town that the woman came back and told everybody?
Probably.
So, I mean, he probably heard it through the
Could have.
town gossip.
Could have been if they were still there. Although, does it give us a timeline of when they return?
Probably. So you can
Verse 27 says, just then his disciples came back. They marveled that he was talking with a woman, so she had not left yet. So, now, but they could have heard it from the people after the people came to him.
Wonder if they passed her when they was going into town and she was going to the well.
Oh, like,
Yeah, like, cause when they went
Could
into
have.
town for food and then she was coming to the well, they was going into town cause they had left to go. I mean, it makes you wonder
if they could have had an interaction with her and they didn't.
and they didn't,
Yeah.
because they passed her by, because they would have probably not even shared the road with her.
You know, that's interesting because what if they would have met and they kind of done a walk around?
Because they wouldn't have probably shared the road with her.
And then they get back and who's talking to her?
That's why there's some names that he's speaking.
That's a great point. I got to give Tina credit today. Wasn't you, Mary? Sorry.
I don't know, that's just what I wanted.
Yeah. And that's a great point because if that happened and then they walk back and they see that Christ is talking to her, what does that do to them? Yeah. Man, that's a conversation I should have had. Has that ever happened to y'all? Like you see, man, it happened to me one time. I was in a restaurant and me and a guy this is when I was in Jonesboro, me and a guy would meet, I think it was Tuesdays or Thursdays, one day anyway. We would meet for lunch. He was a guy I grew up with. He was actually one that witnessed to me that allowed me to step over the line and say, yeah, I need to be saved. He was a couple of years older than me. And we grew up in church together. He had got married. They went to a different church now, but we had just kind of always stayed connected. And we were sitting at a restaurant eating, and we would always pray. We would have kind of prayer lists, and we would go through, and we would always pray, before the meal, but then we'd pray before we left. And the waitress walks up, and he, out of the blue, just says, "Ma'am, we're going to pray before we leave. Just want to know if there's anything that we can pray for you about." And she starts bawling. And there was a situation with her son. Not to go into detail, but a situation with her son, and so before she left, we prayed. And after that was over, I was sitting there thinking, he's not pastor, I am, and yet he's the one that thought, not that I'm any better than him, I don't mean that. It was just a conviction moment of, that wasn't in my mind to ask her. And I kind of felt bad. I did feel bad in that moment. And they would have too, if they would have got back. And he was sitting there talking, and they passed her before. Even just,
Moment too, because they would know now.
Yeah.
That's what I need to be doing.
and even if you think about it too, them just going into the village, they would have been very cautious because it was the Samaritan people, and they would not have wanted to interact any more than they could. But especially if they knew she was and they would have suspected something if they did meet her. Why is she coming to the well at noon? This is not a normal time, and she's by herself. Not normal. They would have suspected something. That's a great point. So our assumption is that either the woman or the people of the village shared with John, or Christ did at some point in time. The whole point is someone had to talk to John about what went on. Because he knows the conversation they had. Someone had to tell him that. Maybe he was inspired by God and got it all in that way. We know he was inspired by God. But we also don't want to take out the factor of John would have had an interest in why this occurred. All right, question 6. What was the woman's reaction in verse 9? Why did she react that way? So verse 9, so Christ has just asked her for a drink, and then John notes in verse 8, and this is again him writing in retrospect for our benefit, for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. So John was noting, we're not there. Verse 9, then the Samaritan woman said to him, how is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? Why did she react in that way?
I think she was surprised by the interaction.
Yeah.
He was actually kind to her to speak to her.
Do you think people today that may know that we go to church and we take the time to interact with them or help them, do you think that they are surprised sometimes? And if so, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I think sometimes in general, people judge people just by saying by looks, appearance. And a lot of people get walked by just because of their looks or appearance. And I think they're taken back if anybody stops and is friendly or helpful to them and treats them like a human being and the same as they are. And that's probably how she felt. Is,
Yeah.
why are you being so nice to me when y'all don't have nothing to do with us, but you're treating me like an actual human, which is what we should do. We shouldn't judge people like that.
You know, if we're truly following Christ, trying to be like Christ, then there should be no one that we walk by and not talk to.
Yes.
And no one should be surprised that we talk to them. And she has a surprise here in her, from what she is noted by John. It appears she is surprised that he's talking to her, which means people in the past have not talked to her and they've not interacted. And we know the whole Jewish Samaritan thing. John actually notes that for us. But at the same sense today, people know if you're in church. Some of you wear shirts that say the church on it, which is a great thing, as long as you're doing right while you're wearing that. So if you're,
Keep us accountable.
Too. I mean, I would be if I walked up and they never spoke to me, and you get there and it's just you and this man that you don't know who he is, and then he starts talking to you and talks to you nicely. I mean, it would probably take me back a little bit. Like, what does he want, or what is going to,
yeah.
I don't know. It would just be.
But it's a unique reaction. And when we think about people today, if they know we go to church and they're surprised that we talk to them, that's not a good thing. Because we should be, just as Christ, friendly to everyone. All right, question 7, should the gospel be limited by the social barriers of the culture? And does it ever become this way? I think we know the answer to the first part, right? The gospel should never be limited by social barriers. Does it ever become this way? We're afraid to answer that one, right?
Because you're gonna say why.
Yeah.
Then we gotta answer again.
Mary, I wish you were in every class.
One
I
time
think
when
it does because we get comfortable in our own circle of friends and we don't want to step outside those bounds.
Mhm.
So, I mean, if we're socially got a group that we do things with or whatever and we're happy and content, then we don't want to break that group to go and extend the same kindness to somebody else. It's uncomfortable sometimes.
And it's not wrong to have the group, right? Because we need the support to make it through. It's not wrong to have the group.
Just the attitude.
That's right. If we only limit ourselves to the group, then how are we going to reach someone else?
Yeah, one time when I was in Texas, I don't know how it all came about, but for some reason, some of us were like dressing up a little bit for Halloween night or something. It was like on Wednesday night. And I dressed up as a bum man. And people did not recognize me. And I just hung out front, outside. And I was very disappointed in the reaction I got.
Mm-hmm. I think some of you have heard me tell this story. There was actually a minister that done that one time on a Sunday morning. He dressed up as a bum and got there before there was only a few people there, or maybe got there first, and he just laid down on the back pew. And No one interacted with him. And then he got up and went and preached. Yeah.
Doctor should have been involved.
Yeah.
And then what the disciples done, they've done what they supposed to have done. They would have brought people back to Jesus because they went on in town.
That's a good point.
So that culture difference is,
Yeah.
it's almost like they thought they didn't need to talk to them or something, so they fell big time.
They were limited in vision to the need that they had physically, which was, I'm hungry, let's go get food. Yeah, it's,
And they kind of forgot they had spiritual food and they needed to share it.
right. The social barriers, I think, are much bigger than what we give credit to sometimes. We let them be much bigger than what we give credit to sometimes. And especially, and we are, you might say, deep-rooted in the South, and you go back to the 50s, 60s, and even before that, and you had all the racial things that went on, which, by the way, still play into our culture in some ways. And it wasn't right. I mean, to say just because of the color of skin that you're different than me. There are people that have the same color of skin as we do that are all on, they're on every point of the spectrum of life. And it doesn't matter what color of skin they are. They're on every point of that, just the same as we see here. And yet still today, what's the most segregated time of the week today?
Probably Sunday morning.
Sunday morning about 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock. It's probably the most segregated time still in the South, anyway. Now, I know there are different worship styles, and I fully understand that. So I'm not saying that it is all because of that. But there are some things that are still kind of deep-rooted. And we have to be careful that we don't train up more generations to be that way.
That's the way it is. If you notice the elections last night, the first woman, the first black. I told Glenn, I said, why do they have to say that? They're the best person for the job. Why do you have to say, I'm the first woman or I'm the first black person? To me, that's not, that's just throwing it out there. They're trying to get, I just think it's wrong. I think if you're good with the job, good.
We judge people every day. You drive down here from here to Jonesboro, see somebody car trouble on the side or hitchhiking, you're probably not gonna pull over and pick them up.
And sometimes that's for our safety. There is fear of that. And we have to pay attention to what God's leading us to do, because if we are instructed to stop and do this, if it's on our mind, then God has a reason for us to do that. And there's a reason He's talking to us about it.
I picked a guy up out of Perryville one time. I was coming home. He got in the car and we got talking. Come find out he just got out of jail in Perryville. He was trying to make it to Heber Springs. So I'll give you a ride to Walnut Ridge and you can probably catch something there going on down. Does it make you uncomfortable? Sure does. I don't know.
See, my grandfather picked up a man, and the man was hitchhiking with the intention of killing whoever he picked up. And my grandfather picked him up and he started witnessing to him. And he told him, he said, I had every intentions of killing you and robbing you when I got in this car.
That's the thing you find interesting here. Christ has a conversation, but what kind of conversation does He have?
I
Obviously.
passed a young black woman, and she had got run off the road, and I'd witnessed it up there by the bank. I was going to pick up food. And I thought,
Disciple.
Food, if I go back, it's ready, and this is going through my mind. So I thought, I'm gonna turn around, so I went by Riverside, and I come back around, and I passed, a city cop passed her. She was outside her car, and he never stopped. Nobody by the time I made that whole circle, and then he was in front of me and he passed her by, but there was nobody with her. So I thought, okay, so I pulled over to the bank parking lot and I I can do to help you, and it broke her tire. She had a very nice sports car, whatever. So when I get in these messes, I always call Steve, and I say, and he never complains one time. And I said, there's this lady, I said, she's broke down, she got run off the road and her tire's ruined. I said, we need help getting her tire off. He said, okay, he was almost home, he turns around, he comes back. Well, he figures out he needs a floor
Jack.
jack, so he calls Joey. And this girl was traveling, where was she traveling from? St. Louis or something, trying to get back to Little Rock. She was a traveling nurse. Mind you, another cop drove by, never stopped. And they're out there helping her, and she's talking to her mom on the phone. Well, Joey has to take her all the way to Walnut Ridge. She don't know them from Adam. I'd left at that time because I said, I want to go get the food. They're going to think we're not picking it up. She's worried. And it gets dark, and Steve comes to the house to get lights, and she gets in the car with Joey. We come back, and I went back with Steve, and I was talking to her, and she hugged me real big, and she said, my mom was scared to death for me to get in the car. She said, how do you know he's not going to kill you? And I would be the same way. But she said, I can't tell you how much I appreciate y'all helping me. She said, because I would have just been stuck here for however long. But it's easy to do because you just think, food. That's not food. But,
So, was she a Christian?
we never asked her. I didn't. Did you, Joey?
We
Yeah,
talked.
okay. See, Joey was in the car with her.
I was about 2 hours. We talked to the woman of that church. She goes some, but not a lot. But we talked about, how God allowed us to stop with her.
Yeah.
So she got to hear a witness, and Caleb went all the way down the Walnut Ridge and back. So
And that was my point in it. Like, we can stop and help people, but those ordained moments, I'm going to call it, if they're God ordained, are really only effective if we give them what they really need. And notice that's what Christ gives her, what she really needs. It's not the water that comes out of the well, it's the living water that he was there to provide her. All right, look at question 8. What does Nicodemus's response and this woman's response have in common? So if you look at verse 11, the woman said to him, Sir, you have nothing to draw water with, and the well is deep. Where do you get the living water? And if you go back to Nicodemus's response, in chapter 3, verse 4, Christ had just said to him, Truly, truly, I say to you, unless one is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. Nicodemus said to him, How can a man be born when he is old? Can he enter a second time into his mother's womb and be born? So that's Nicodemus's response. You look at her response. Jesus has just said to her, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. And the woman says, Sir, you have nothing to draw water with and the well is deep. Where do you get that living water? Christ. Yeah, what were they replying in? Spiritual or physical thought? Physical thought, right? And we do that, don't we? I mean, our first reaction sometimes is typically the physical, when really, I mean, he had just given them a spiritual discussion and they are responding in the physical way. And if we're not careful, we do the same thing. And typically when we ask someone, do you need help? We're looking for the physical answer back. And maybe what they're trying to give us without knowing how to do it is that they have a much bigger need than just the physical. But the physical was the way that we are to interact with them. Question 9, thinking about the discussion Jesus had with her about water and living water, do we ever deprive ourselves of physical nourishment? So he talks to her about physical water. He talks to her about the difference, the living water, right? Do we ever deprive ourselves of physical nourishment? And do we enjoy it? Do you enjoy it?
Apparently Tina doesn't. She took off for the food, huh?
Do we like going without food, water, Any of that? What typically happens when we do? There's even a commercial about it. What's the Snickers commercial? Hangry or something like that? We don't like it. Could the same be true for spiritual nourishment?
Probably even more so, because it nags at you and it just,
But do we recognize it as that?
if you're right with God, you would, I think.
If we're truly walking side by side with God, we probably would. Which then maybe tells us that like we have room to grow in our spiritual walk because we don't always recognize that, right? We have a
Spiritual nourishment when we pray. And spiritual nourishment from this. That's we're studying the word together, or when I'm studying it in private.
right. Yeah, all of those things. You know, we come together corporately to worship, worship services, Sunday school classes, whatever it may be, all of that. And even sometimes that circle that Tina was talking about of just, you know, our people that we are believers that we kind of hang out with, you know, we can get some nourishment from that as well from a spiritual sense if the conversation is spiritual.
Also, when you're preaching the word,
We need physical nourishment sometimes more than 3 times a day, but we typically in society, we think about it being 3 times a day, right? Some people I know eat twice a day. Some people eat all day.
You know, there's a lot
Why?
of said, you talk about reading the Bible, and I'm not the most, how would you say that? Dedicated, but this, you get something on your mind, sometimes you get thinking about it, you can pick that Bible up, and you don't know where you're going. You're just kind of blind led, but you can read something, you think, boy, you get a spiritual lift out of reading that one scripture. Because you've read it probably 100 times, and today points something different.
I think you need to be really cautious about the spiritual part, because your body will let you know when you're hungry. And if you're not careful, you can shut the spirit to where it doesn't let you know.
Or we don't recognize it's letting us know.
Right.
So how often should we feed ourselves spiritually? Yeah.
The more you feed it, the better, the more it grows, the stronger your faith becomes.
Yeah,
The
that's
more
interesting.
hungry you become.
The more physically we eat, the more we grow.
Better watch yourself.
Would that be true spiritually? And physically, we think about it in kind of a negative way, but spiritually, would it be wrong for us to continue to grow?
We need it.
No, we need to.
And the more you grow, the more you crave it, in my experience. The more you learn, the more you want to learn something else, the deeper you get, the stronger your faith becomes.
Yep. All right, question 10 then. What does verse 15 tell us about the woman's life? So verse 15 says, the woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I will not be thirsty or have to come here to draw water." What does this tell us about her life?
That wasn't fulfilled, there was something she needed.
Yeah, that there was her life was not easy. So when we think about, you know, our life today, all of us have experienced times when life was not easy. And Christ is telling her the answer is not in something physical. The answer is in the living water that he can supply. Just like I mentioned to you, Austin, that came forward Sunday morning. You know, he found what gave him joy. And we all have to find that in life as well. Question 11, why do you think Jesus told her to go call her husband to come when he knew she did not have a husband? Was this a difference in terminology, just in the way John recorded it? Did Jesus forget that she did not have one? What was he trying to do? So did he forget?
Be honest.
What's that?
I think he's trying to see if she's gonna be honest.
Could be that he was seeing, you know, how her response would be to that.
And maybe he wanted This is his way of showing her who he is, because he already knew, and he told her that.
She perceived that he was a prophet after that, which let her know that he was something special, I'm going to use the word. Didn't really show her, she didn't recognize who he truly was at that moment in time. What else could he have been trying to do there?
Get her to pass the word around without.
Okay.
Because if she had 5 husbands, I mean, you know, she told all 5 of them. It's kind of spreading it around.
George, Sam, Fred, come on.
She could have Kevin, she could have been to the point, like the lady that had all the husbands that had died,
Yep.
and she just gave up on the marriage part of it.
Just gonna live with one, she didn't have to marry another one to die.
Well, he wasn't with her at the well, so I don't know if she was, maybe she was just a housekeeper to him or whatever.
Well, Jesus calls it out. The one you're with is not your husband, which means they were living in sin.
Yeah, more of the whatever.
Do you think he was trying to get her to recognize her sinful state?
Or what?
Sinful state.
I think she
Yeah.
knew it.
She wasn't satisfied. She'd been married 5 times. She was with somebody now. She wasn't satisfied there. And
What did marriage consist of in that culture that day and time? You didn't stand up in front of the preacher
now, they had a ceremony. Now, what we know about probably is more Jewish ceremony, but we would assume they would have been close together. I mean, the ceremony went on for days, though. So they had a...
You know, I do some genealogy, and a lot of times 14, 1500s, 1600s, there is no record of a marriage
Right.
because they didn't issue a marriage
Certificate, right.
license.
But there was typically always some type of celebration throughout the years. Now, it may have been, depending on where you are, you get in the Old West and, there probably wasn't the to-do like there is today, obviously. But you go back to Jewish culture, I mean, we see it. Go back to chapter 2. It was a wedding feast that they were at. And they run out of wine. This is a multiple day event. And it was a big deal from run out of wine. So it was it was a big deal. I think Christ may have been wanting to see how honest she was going to be about things. And he identifies to her and he says, what you've said is true, but here's your real state of where you are. And it showed her that he knew everything about her life. And it also should have been humbling to her of where she was in life. Which all of us have to get there in order to truly be saved. To have that joy, we have to realize where we are and where we need to be, and that there's a vast difference between those two, and that we can't make up that difference on our own. It has to be through Christ for that to happen. In verse 19, the woman said that she perceives he's a prophet. What else was she perceiving that was not true from verse 20?
Place to worship.
Yeah, the place to worship. Actually, that he was going to tell her where she needed to go worship. Did he ever tell her that? Notice what she says, though. She says, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet." And then verse 20, she says, "Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship." Christ never told her that. We have no record. John doesn't record that.
But he was a Jew, so.
So she assumed that. We make a lot of assumptions in life. The 2 assumptions she made here were actually wrong. He was a prophet. Now, she knew there was something special. She deemed him a prophet. He was not a prophet. He was the Son of God. Other people had that misperception too. But she perceives what he's about to tell her. And sometimes you will interact with people today, if you try to witness to them in some way, if you just try to let your light of being a Christian show in their life, in some way, they're going to misperceive what you're about to tell them or what you're trying to do. And because of that, they will somewhat shut off. And you have to then somehow bring them back to say, look, I'm not here to judge you. That's not my role. But typically, that's the response that they kind of get, is that, well, if you're a Christian, you're here to judge me. No, it's not what I'm here to do. I'm not here to judge you at all. I'm not trying to say that you're a terrible person. What I'm trying to do is show you that Christ has got something to offer you that you've never had before. It's living water that we talk about. And so we have to break through that. That's the reason I wrote this, is she identifies and has a preconceived thought about what he's going to tell her. And we have to break through that somehow to where we get them to see what they think we're going to say is not really, most of the time, what we're going to say, because we should operate under grace, and we should show grace to other people. And we should realize that the only reason we are where we are is because Christ showed tremendous grace, mercy, forgiveness, all that. He showed all that toward us. Our turn is then, or our responsibility then, is to turn around and show that toward other people. We can't do the forgiveness. It's not our role. But we can show grace toward them. But their assumption is not that we're going to show grace. And so somehow we have to break that barrier. And that it's true, you know, as a pastor, when people find out, pastor, well, you're just here to talk to me about being in church. No, I'm not. I'm not here to talk to you about being in church. It doesn't mean that I'm not going to mention that, but what I'm really here to talk to you about is your relationship with God. Because that's the most important thing. And if your relationship with God is right, you're going to find your way into church.
They assume people that are not living right assume that you're judging them. My neighbor, she wasn't living right, she's still not living right, but she said, I cannot believe, because I visited with her all the time, she could not believe that I wasn't judging her. She didn't think that I should be talking to her at all, or being nice to her. That just has haunted me daily.
That's a guilt trip people get on, so.
But somehow we have to help them get through that, right? We can't just leave them in that state. If they're in a guilt, you know, Don mentioned a guilt trip. If they're in a guilt trip state, we can't leave them there. Like somehow we have to break through that in order to truly show them Christ. Question 13 then, what does it mean to worship in spirit and truth? So look at verse 24. First three words, what does John identify? God is what? Spirit. God is spirit. And Jesus is truth. So to truly worship God, we have to do what? You have to worship God, but you also have to go through the truth to get to Him, right? So Christ says, the time's coming when you will worship in spirit and truth. He actually says the time's coming, time's now here. I mean, he could say the time's now here because he was standing right there with her. And you'll worship in spirit and truth. You'll worship the Father, but you'll also worship the Son. And those two things go together. We can't separate those two things, because if we separate those two things, then we're back to where they were. Was she more concerned about where worship should happen or about how they should worship correctly?
Probably where, because she told him, you know, in that one verse. I think she started out with the worshiping of where.
Right.
But I think after he talked to her, maybe she changed her way of thinking. But at first she was saying, well, you know, you're not supposed to be here, you're supposed to be there to worship.
And the deal with her making that statement about, you tell us, where's it at? Yeah, verse 20. Our fathers worship on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where we are to worship. That goes back to that whole Jewish Samaritan thing. The Samaritans built their own temple to worship in. Jews had their temple in Jerusalem. Samaritans had theirs. And the Jews said that worship should only happen at the Jewish temple. And so they didn't consider the Samaritans worshiping at their temple to actually be worship. Now, they were mixing in some other gods. They weren't exactly doing things right, but the Jewish people weren't doing things right either, right? We see that because Christ walks in and clears out a whole section of it at one point in time, twice, actually. So it appears that she was more concerned about where it should happen than it happening correctly, and Christ changes that conversation, and that's why you find him go to, in verse 22, you worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews, but the hour is coming and is now here. So basically he gave her a history lesson in verse 22. Verse 23 is, let's talk about where we are right now. The hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father is seeking such people to worship him. Does he mention a location at all? Was Jesus concerned about where the worship was going to take place?
Not aware of it, who you were gonna worship.
Yeah.
But what would we tell somebody? They'd say, where do you worship at? Well, Sutton? Is that what we'd say?
That gets in, I know it gets into us defining some of these words that we use in Christian language today. Because what do we mean by worship? What is worship?
Gathering.
Okay, but when we talk about, so worship can be a gathering together. What else is worship? Praising God. Okay. Those are both true, but very broad, so let's narrow it down. So what is worship, what does praising God actually mean?
Doing his will.
Okay. Okay.
Being thankful.
Okay. Now, action-wise, how do we do those things? Witnessing? What'd you say? The way we live? What else? Sing. Sing? Does that have to be here? No. You can worship in your car going down the road, right? So when we say, like Don brought up, people may ask you where you worship. You know what the right answer to that is?
Anywhere, all the time.
Everywhere. Now, where do I attend a church? Sutton. But I worship everywhere. Because I'm always, hopefully, this is what can be said, I'm always a follower of God, follower of Christ.
This building should be like an educational, you get trained here to go out.
It's an equipping place. We worship here too, right? Because we do come together. Ms. Janice talked about sings here, that's worship here. When we preach, that's worship, because we're looking at God's word and we're communicating it. God's using the communication of the word, working through his spirit to touch hearts and lives of people. When we sing together, same thing, we're worshiping in that time. When we sit in Sunday school and we discuss God's word and we talk about our lives and what's went on, it's a form of worship when we're talking about it from a godly standpoint. When we stand out here in the foyer and we visit with each other and we talk about things that are maybe bothering us or things that we're about to go through, and we somehow throw in there, but I know God's got all of this. It's a form of worship as well. But it's not just here. And that's what's been an issue in the American Christian church, is we have regulated worship of God to a building. That's why I wrote this down. She was concerned about that. You say we're supposed to worship in Jerusalem, we worship here. He says, there's a time coming, it's even now, that you're going to worship in spirit and truth, and it's not going to be in a building. Right?
I think another way that goes along with it is giving God credit for the good things that go on in their life.
Absolutely.
This might be not much of an example, but, you know, I had a great day today. Boy, things went right for me. It should have said, God blessed me with a good day today, and explained how and why.
That's a form of worship.
And I thought of that. I thought about the elections last night. I heard some giving their acceptance speech, and I thought, what a great opportunity they had to say, God really blessed me here. And he pulled me through this, let me win this, you know.
Yeah.
Nobody mentioned God.
I'm going to, and I mean this toward no one individually. So if you're here Sunday night, this is not meant toward you individually. Sunday night in service, when we'd asked for the choir, come up, and Delbert got up on stage, and I said, why don't you see if there's any testimonies tonight? And he said, okay. So we sung, I think, 2 songs maybe, and then he said, anybody have a testimony tonight? You know what happened? Nobody. So when Brother Joe was talking about what a platform that those individuals had, obviously they were reaching way more people than what we were here. But there was a ballpark of 75 people probably, ballpark again, that were sitting in here. Well, no, there's more than that. There was 115 because the kids hadn't left yet. And I think they counted 115. So there's 115 people that could have been impacted by someone saying what you just said. I've had a great week. God's blessed me with it. And so when we think about those platforms and those opportunities, like, yeah, people have them with a microphone in front of their face to broadcast on TV. And yes, that is a tremendous opportunity. But what about the opportunities that we have that here on a local level we don't take, even when asked? Anybody want to talk about the goodness of God? And maybe we need to change that terminology. Instead of saying anybody got a testimony, maybe we need to change that terminology and say, anybody want to talk about the goodness of God in their life this week? Does that change anything? I don't know if it does or not. And Brother Joe opened my eyes during his prayer, and I hadn't said anything about it till now. But in his prayer, he actually said, God, thank you for these elections. And he didn't say that they turned out the way that they did. He said for the election. Are we thankful that we get the opportunity to vote? Yeah. I hadn't stopped and thanked God that I had the opportunity to go vote, and that that he gave me that method to be able to speak into the community actually by who I vote for. I didn't think about doing that. So you humbled me today, by the way.
He did last week too.
He did last week too. He's good at that.
Yeah.
That we don't thank God for, that he does for us. Because he does all 24 hours a day. He's helped us some way or another.
Mm-hmm.
And during their oxygen.
And so much of the time, we don't thank him for just the simple things that he does for us, that if he hadn't, we wouldn't be the way we are.
We take too much for granted.
I think of these people that has the oxygen on,
Mm-hmm.
and that makes me stop and think every day. The Lord hadn't come up with a way to do that. You just died.
Right.
Like be a fish out of water. So I'm thankful every day he's got the oxygen turned on.
Yeah. For all of us, right?
Do you think that when you pray, for example, I pray every night, and I thank God for keeping his hand upon my family the way that he did throughout the day. You think he ever gets tired of that?
No. Never.
You wouldn't get tired of somebody coming up and thanking you every day for the same thing over and over and over?
I'm not God.
Well, I know. Believe me, I know.
I knew that was coming.
He doesn't get
But
My reason for saying that is I'm in a human mind. He's much higher than what I am. He created us to glorify him. That was why we were created, was to glorify him. So, no.
I do it every night, and I'm thinking, Lord, please don't think I'm just saying this to be repeating, because
Now, if it
I'm
becomes
sincere when
that,
I say it.
right. Now, if it becomes just a repetition of, hey, God, thank you for today, then, yeah, we're kind of crossing over into, we're just becoming ritualistic in what we're doing. But if we're truly, like you said, you're sincere in it, thanking Him for the day, that's glorifying God.
I think you have to come here and get tired of not hearing it.
That's right. That's right. But the reason I had the question there at the bottom is we sometimes think that the only time we can worship is on Sunday morning or Sunday night or whenever your time is here at the building. And we've got to break out of that mentality, because our worship should go on every moment of the day. And if it did, people would see a different church than what they see. I'm meaning that across the board, not just here, but it would be here too. But they would see a different church in the American culture if we were truly thankful to God every day, every moment, and not just when we walk in the doors.
Well, somebody's been talking Wednesday morning up because it's growing. It may not be a drove running in here, but if you just pick up one or two,
Yeah.
it's growing one or two at a time.
Yeah.
That's the way the Lord
Started
works.
out with about 15.
Yeah. May have been even less than that at one point. Yeah.
About 8, I think it was there for a while.
I think the thing that, if you walk away today and you say, what do I take out of the overall of what we talked about? Christ was teaching her that the physical things that she had relied on did not need to be relied on anymore. Physical water, physical place that she would go and worship. And he says, I've got something, living water, that's going to satisfy you, that you'll never thirst again. She brings up, y'all say that we need to worship in Jerusalem. We say we worship here. He says, you worship in spirit and truth. In other words, you worship through me, truth, Christ. And you still worship the Father, but it's in spirit and truth, both of us together.
But it doesn't never say what she did after that, does it? Does it say that she went back and left the man she was living with, or that she married the man did she change her way of living? It doesn't tell us that, does it?
She went back and kicked him out.
It doesn't say what she did multiple days later, no. The only action that we see is that she went and she said, let me tell you about these people, about this individual that I've met that told me everything that I ever did. And for some reason, there was enough interest that they went to him.
She had to be
And-
somewhat convincing, because
right.
her lifestyle and her being alone at the well to be separate from everyone else. They shouldn't have accepted her message, but they understood it was real.
Yeah, if you go down to verse 42, which gets into our next week's study, but if you go down to verse 42, it says, they said to the woman, so this is the crowd that went to Jesus after she had went and told them about him. It says, it is no longer because of what you said that we believe, for we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this is indeed the Savior of the world. So in other words, her testimony originally piqued their interest, and they went then to the living water, and they found the living water, and no longer did they believe because of her. Now, getting them to the point to believe was because of her, which is the role you and I play. They shouldn't believe in us, and they shouldn't believe just because we said it, because ultimately it's got to become their faith, because if it doesn't become their faith, then they're going to walk away from it at some point in time. This is what happens to teenagers or kids. We bring them up in church, but we never bring them along to where it becomes their faith. And because that doesn't happen, then they've just went because that's what I'm supposed to do. And we've got to get them to the point that they want to go, and they want to read their Bible, and they want to, I'm going to use this term that we just talked about, they want to worship every day. And that's what, because we forget about, if we think in our lives that, somewhere in the past, we probably regulated worship to Sunday morning or Sunday and Wednesday. We think about the impact that had on us, and yes, we can change us, and we can be different, but think about all the people that we influenced before that. So our kids, as they grew up and they saw us worship on Sunday morning at church and Sunday night at church, and they didn't see us worship Monday through Saturday, they've already been impacted. And how do we change that in them now? Yes, we can change us, but we've already left a legacy in some way. I'm not saying it can't be changed, but we've left a legacy that says worship was only on Sunday morning. And now we have to try and change or train, teach an adult to break from what they learned as a child, because they learned seeing their parent grow up that worship happened on Sunday morning and that was the only time. And now that we're having to say, okay, adults, that's not the case, because Christ says it's not a place. It should be every day in your life that it goes on. So how do we break that? I'm not asking for an answer. I'm just saying, like, we can change ourselves, but as parents, grandparents, we have to realize we made an impact, maybe in a negative way. We didn't mean to. And we thought we were doing well, and we were, by bringing them to church. But it was what we done Monday through Saturday that was not what we needed to do. And because of that, they didn't see God being a part of our daily life. And so they've now regulated it to, and let's get to where we really are in American culture, to Sunday morning at 11 o'clock or 10:30. Because they've not included Sunday school, they've just included Sunday morning worship.
Well, I didn't know till an older age that they had church on Wednesdays, because Mom never went and never took us on Wednesdays,
Mm-hmm.
Sunday was the only time we went to church.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess I was in high school.
Any other thoughts or questions? Mary, anything?
I'll keep it to myself right now.
Okay. Well, let's have a word of prayer